A blind stranger took my hand and said, "Pretend to be my mother." I never imagined those words would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own life. 1 hour later, my husband's secret collapsed like a house of cards. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, but for the longest time, I felt like I had no name at all. Just another face in the crowd, another body moving through the motions of a life that somehow wasn't mine anymore. At 72 years old, I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the rent ate up most of our monthly income and the walls seemed to close in a little more each day. Every morning, I would wake up at 5:30 to the sound of garbage trucks rumbling down Broadway, their mechanical groaning mixing with the distant hum of early commuters. The apartment smelled of old coffee grounds and that musty scent that clings to fabric that's seen too many years. I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the hardwood floors creaking under my feet like old bones protesting another day. My husband, Richard, would already be gone, always gone. These days, he left before dawn and returned after midnight, claiming his consulting business demanded more and more of his time. I'd find his coffee cup still warm in the sink, a cruel reminder that I'd missed him by minutes. Again. That Thursday morning in early October was supposed to be different. I had circled it on our kitchen calendar with a red pen, our 47th wedding anniversary. I'd bought his favorite pastries from the bakery on 86th Street, the ones with the almond filling he used to love when we were young and poor and happy. I set the table with our good china, the set my mother had given us when we married, and I even put on the blue dress he'd once said made my eyes sparkle. I waited until noon, then 1 o'clock, then 2. My phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. A text from Richard. "Business meeting ran over. Can't make dinner. Rain check? Rain check. On our anniversary." I stared at that message until the screen went dark, my reflection ghost-like in the black glass. When had I become so transparent? When had my presence become so optional that our wedding anniversary could be postponed like a dentist appointment? I walked to our bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept our photo albums. There, on top, was a picture from our wedding day. I was 25, radiant in my grandmother's lace dress, and Richard was 27, his hair thick and dark, his eyes full of promise. We looked like we could conquer the world together. Now I couldn't even conquer his attention for one evening. The apartment felt suffocating. I needed air, space, somewhere the walls wouldn't whisper about all the ways I'd become invisible. I grabbed my coat and walked the 12 blocks to Riverside Park, where the Hudson River runs alongside Manhattan like a liquid promise of somewhere else. I'd been sitting on a bench for maybe 20 minutes, watching joggers and dog walkers and people with somewhere important to be, when I felt a hand brush against mine. "Excuse me," a voice said. Young, female, with that careful pronunciation of someone who's used to speaking clearly. "I don't mean to startle you, but I'm looking for someone to help me." I turned to see a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and dark sunglasses. She held a white cane in her left hand, and her right hand was extended toward me with a kind of hopeful desperation. "I'm Sarah," she said, "and I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need someone to pretend to be my mother, just for an hour, maybe less." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "My mother," she repeated, and now I could hear the trembling in her voice. "I need you to pretend to be my mother. There's a meeting I have to attend, and if I show up alone, I'll lose everything. But if my mother is with me—" She paused, her fingers finding mine and gripping them with surprising strength. "Please. I know it sounds insane, but I'm desperate. Have you ever had one of those moments where the universe seems to pause, waiting for your decision? Where everything that comes after hinges on a single word? What kind of meeting?" I asked. Sarah's face crumpled with relief. "A business meeting. I inherited my father's investment company when he died 3 years ago. It's worth millions. Stocks, cryptocurrency, even some gold holdings. But there are men who think a blind woman can't run a business. They're trying to force me out, to buy my shares for a fraction of what they're worth. Today's the vote." She squeezed my hand tighter. "If I show up alone, they'll paint me as isolated, incompetent. But if my mother is there, supporting me, vouching for me, she trailed off. My real mother died when I was 16. I've been alone ever since. Sometimes being alone makes you look weak to people who profit from weakness. Something about her words pierced through the fog of my own disappointment. Here was someone who understood what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, treated as less than whole. "Where is this meeting?" I heard myself ask. "The Meridian Building, 42nd floor. We'd need to be there in an hour." I should have said no. Any rational person would have said no. But rationality had gotten me 47 years of forgotten anniversaries and empty apartments. Maybe it was time to try something different. What would I need to do? Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Just be there. Look proud of me. Maybe squeeze my hand if they start talking down to me. Let them know I'm not alone. An hour later, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, wearing my best black dress and the pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. Sarah sat beside me, her fingers steady on my wrist, drawing strength from my presence. Across from us sat 5 men in expensive suits, their faces carrying that particular arrogance of people who'd never been told no. The lead man, someone named Carlson, was mid-50s with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Patterson," he was saying to Sarah, "we understand this is emotional for you. Losing your father, inheriting such complex financial responsibilities. But running an investment firm requires experience, relationships, a certain visibility in the business world. I have a Harvard MBA," Sarah said calmly. "I've been working with the firm for 8 years. Our portfolio has grown by 30% since I took over." "Yes, but managing money is about more than numbers," another man chimed in. "It's about client confidence, about trust. And frankly, in your condition, clients worry about competence." I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my wrist. The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he couldn't even say the word blind, made my blood boil. It was the same tone Richard used when he dismissed my opinions about money, about our future, about anything that mattered. "My daughter," I heard myself say, "has built more wealth in 3 years than most people see in a lifetime. She's turned her father's modest investment business into a multi-million-dollar firm with holdings in everything from blue-chip stocks to cryptocurrency to precious metals." Carlson's eyes shifted to me for the first time. "And you are?" "Eleanor Patterson," I lied smoothly, using my middle name. "Sarah's mother, and a retired financial advisor myself." It wasn't entirely untrue. I had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for 20 years before Richard convinced me to stay home. I'd always had a head for numbers, even if no one in my family had bothered to notice. "Mrs. Patterson," Carlson said, his tone shifting to the patronizing sweetness men reserve for women they think they can manipulate. "Surely you understand our concerns. Running a business requires full engagement, complete attention to detail. Your daughter faces unique challenges." "The only challenge my daughter faces," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "is working with people who mistake blindness for inability. She can read a balance sheet in Braille faster than you can read it in print. She knows the sound of a client's voice well enough to hear uncertainty, confidence, or deception. She remembers every number, every detail, every conversation, because she can't rely on visual notes." Sarah squeezed my hand, and I felt her pride radiating through her fingers. "Moreover," I continued, feeling 47 years of swallowed words rising to the surface, "her net worth has increased by 40% in the past year alone. Her clients' portfolios have outperformed the market consistently. She's diversified into emerging markets, cryptocurrency, and sustainable energy stocks, while you gentlemen were still debating whether Tesla was a passing fad." The room had gone quiet. Carlson's patronizing smile faltered. "The question isn't whether Sarah can run this company," I said, standing up. "The question is whether you can afford to lose her expertise to a competitor who values talent over assumptions." Sarah stood beside me, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. "Gentlemen, I came here prepared to discuss your buyout offer. But after hearing your concerns, I've realized something important. You're not buying me out because you think I'm incompetent. You're buying me out because you know exactly how competent I am, and it threatens you." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. These are offers from 3 other firms who've asked me to bring my client base and business model to them. All 3 offers are substantially higher than yours. All 3 firms see my abilities as assets, not liabilities. The silence stretched like a held breath. I'll be withdrawing from these negotiations, Sarah continued. My company isn't for sale. Not to you, not at any price. We walked out together, my arm linked through hers, leaving 5 very surprised men in very expensive suits, staring at spreadsheets that suddenly didn't add up the way they expected. In the elevator, Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I couldn't have done that alone. Yes, you could have, I said. You just needed to believe it. But as we stepped out into the bustling lobby of the Meridian building, Sarah's phone began to ring. She answered it with a frown. Then her face went pale. What? She said. When? Are you sure? She hung up and turned to me, her expression stricken. Margaret, because I know that's your real name. I heard you hesitate when you said Eleanor. That call was from my private investigator. I hired him 6 months ago because I suspected someone was trying to sabotage my business from the inside. My stomach dropped. What did he find? Richard Henley, your husband. He's been providing those men with inside information about my company's vulnerabilities. Client lists, financial reports, strategic plans. Everything they needed to make their takeover attempt look legitimate. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. That's impossible. Richard works in consulting. He doesn't even know your company exists. Sarah's expression was gentle but firm. Margaret, your husband has been working with Carlson Industries for 2 years. They've been paying him substantial sums. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to gather intelligence on firms they want to acquire, including mine. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph. Richard, my Richard, sitting in a restaurant booth across from Carlson, both men laughing over what looked like a very expensive bottle of wine. This was taken last Tuesday, Sarah said quietly. The same day he told you he was working late, right? My legs gave out. I found myself sitting on a lobby bench, staring at a picture that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my marriage. There's more, Sarah said, sitting beside me. The investigator found financial records. Your husband has been siphoning money from your joint accounts to fund his lifestyle. The expensive dinners, the business trips, the new car he bought last month. It's all been paid for with money that was meant to be your shared security. I thought about our dwindling savings, about the way Richard had convinced me we needed to tighten our belts, about the times I'd skipped my doctor appointments or avoided buying new clothes because he said we couldn't afford it. He's been building a separate life, Sarah continued. A life funded by your money and his betrayal of people like me, companies like mine. The investigator estimates he's stolen close to $200,000 from your accounts over the past 18 months. $200,000. My inheritance from my mother, our retirement fund, the money I'd saved penny by penny over decades of careful budgeting. Margaret, Sarah said, her voice almost a whisper, there's something else. The investigator found evidence that Richard and Carlson have been planning something bigger. They want to buy out several small investment firms and merge them into one large company. Richard was supposed to get a substantial cut, enough to start a new life somewhere. A new life without me, I said, and it wasn't a question. The papers are already drawn up. Divorce documents, filed but not served. He was planning to leave you with nothing once this deal went through. I sat in that lobby for what felt like hours, watching people come and go, their lives continuing while mine crumbled into something unrecognizable. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my future, my security, it was all built on lies. But then something strange happened. Instead of the crushing despair I expected to feel, a different emotion began to rise in my chest. It started as a flicker, then grew steady and bright. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger. For 47 years, I had made myself small. I had swallowed my opinions, doubted my instincts, apologized for taking up space. I had let Richard convince me that I was lucky to have him, that my contributions didn't matter, that my needs were secondary to his comfort. And all the while, he had been stealing from me, lying to me, planning to discard me like an old coat he'd outgrown. Sarah, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. I need your help with something. She turned to me with curiosity and concern. I need to take back my life. The next few hours were a blur of activity that felt like the first real purpose I'd had in decades. Sarah introduced me to her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who listened to our story with the focused attention of someone who'd seen too many variations of the same betrayal. Mrs. Henley, Patricia said, after reviewing the evidence Sarah's investigator had gathered. You have grounds for both criminal charges and civil recovery. Your husband has committed fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. We can freeze your joint accounts immediately and file for an emergency hearing to recover your stolen assets. Within 2 hours it was done. Richard's access to our accounts was terminated. The court had issued a temporary restraining order preventing him from disposing of any joint assets. Patricia had filed papers to recover every stolen dollar, plus damages and attorney fees. But the most satisfying moment came when we went to the bank together. I walked into the marble lobby of Chase Manhattan with my shoulders straight and my voice clear. The same bank where Richard had convinced me to remove my name from our business accounts to simplify the paperwork. The same bank where he'd taken out a second mortgage on our apartment without telling me. I need to speak with the branch manager, I told the teller. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from a concerned-looking man in his 40s who reviewed the court documents with growing alarm. Mrs. Henley, he said, I'm extremely sorry about this situation. We should have required both signatures for these large withdrawals. Your husband told us you were suffering from early-stage dementia and couldn't handle financial decisions anymore. Dementia. Richard had told them I had dementia. The anger that had been simmering all afternoon suddenly boiled over. Do I seem mentally incompetent to you? I asked. No, ma'am, not at all. In fact, you seem remarkably sharp. Then perhaps your bank should be more careful about accepting the word of a man who's stealing from his own wife. By 5 o'clock, I had my own accounts, my own banker, and my own financial advisor. A younger woman who treated me like a human being instead of a confused elderly person who needed managing. But the hardest part was still ahead. I had to go home and face Richard. I sat in the taxi heading back to our apartment, watching the familiar streets of Manhattan blur past the window. How many times had I ridden through these same blocks, coming home from doctor appointments or grocery shopping or the occasional lunch with old friends, always rushing back to accommodate Richard's schedule, his needs, his expectations. The driver, a kind-faced man in his 60s, caught my eye in the rearview mirror. You okay back there, lady? You look like you've had a rough day. Actually, I said, surprising myself, I think I've had the best day I've had in years. He smiled. Good for you. Sometimes the worst days turn out to be the ones that change everything. When I walked into our apartment at 6:30 p.m., Richard was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, talking on the phone in the low, conspiratorial tone I'd learned to recognize but never questioned. No, he was saying. The Patterson situation is handled. The old woman won't be a problem anymore. Sarah's completely isolated now. He paused, listening. Trust me, Carlson. By next month, we'll own her entire portfolio. He looked up as I walked in, and I saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe. Or calculation. I have to go, he said into the phone. We'll talk tomorrow. He closed the laptop and smiled at me with the same false warmth he'd perfected over decades of marriage. Margaret, you're out late. Where were you? I set my purse on the counter and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. When had his smile become so practiced? When had his concern become so hollow? I was helping someone, I said. Someone who needed a mother. Richard's smile flickered. That's nice, dear. You know how much I admire your charitable nature. Charitable nature. As if my kindness was something quaint and irrelevant, like collecting ceramic figurines. Richard, I said, we need to talk. Of course. Let me just grab us some wine. He started toward the cabinet where we kept our good bottles, the ones we'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come. No wine, I said. Just talking. He sat back down, his expression shifting into what I now recognized as his managing Margaret mode. The patient, slightly patronizing attention he gave me when he needed me to agree to something. What's on your mind? I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, placing Patricia's business card and the court documents on the table between us. Richard's face went white. "What is this?" he asked, though from his expression, he knew exactly what it was. "It's the end," I said simply. For a moment, we stared at each other across our little kitchen table, surrounded by 47 years of shared meals and shared lies. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been widening for decades without my noticing. "Margaret," Richard said finally, and his voice carried a wheedling tone I'd never heard before. "Let me explain." "Explain what? Explain how you told our bank I had dementia so you could steal our money? Explain how you've been working with men who want to destroy a young woman's business? Explain how you've already filed for divorce and plan to leave me with nothing?" Each word came out cleaner and sharper than I'd expected. For so many years, confrontation had felt impossible, like trying to argue with the weather. But now, with evidence spread out in front of us, the truth felt solid and undeniable. Richard reached across the table, his hand seeking mine. "Honey, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. The consulting business is brutal. I was just trying to secure our future." I looked down at his hand, the same hand that had held mine at our wedding, that had touched my face when our children were born, that had signed documents to steal from me. "Whose future, Richard? Because according to these papers, your future didn't include me at all." His composure cracked, and for the first time in years I saw something real in his expression. Panic. The divorce papers. That was just a precaution, a legal strategy. I never intended to actually leave you. You took $200,000 from our accounts. You mortgaged our apartment without telling me. You told people I was mentally incompetent. I stood up, and for the first time in our marriage, I was looking down at him. "What part of that sounds like love to you?" Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. "I'm 69 years old, Richard. I've spent 47 years making excuses for you, accommodating you, shrinking myself to fit around the edges of your ambition. I've forgotten birthdays alone, eaten dinner alone, slept alone even when you were in the bed next to me. I've been the perfect invisible wife." I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. But today, someone needed me, really needed me. A young woman who's brilliant and capable and fighting for her right to exist in a world that wants to diminish her. And you were one of the men trying to diminish her. When I turned back to face him, Richard was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "Margaret, please. We can work this out. I'll make it up to you. I'll pay back every penny." "With what money? The money you stole from me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You're going to pack a bag tonight and stay somewhere else. My lawyer will be in touch about the division of assets, the assets that are legally mine. You're going to resign from whatever arrangement you had with Carlson Industries, and you're going to make sure Sarah Patterson's business is left alone. And if I don't?" I smiled, and it felt strange on my face after so many years of careful, accommodating expressions. "Then Patricia, that's my lawyer, will file criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Apparently, stealing from your spouse is still illegal in New York State, even if you've been married for 47 years. Richard stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. I suppose, in a way, I had. That night, after Richard packed a bag and left with mumbled promises to figure things out, I sat in our apartment, my apartment, for the first time in decades without the weight of someone else's needs pressing down on me. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city continue its endless dance of lights and movement. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably celebrating her victory, her right to run her own company, her refusal to be diminished by men who profited from her doubt. And somewhere else, Richard was learning what it felt like to have his comfortable assumptions stripped away. But I wasn't thinking about either of them. Not really. I was thinking about Margaret Henley, 72 years old, sitting alone in a Manhattan apartment with her future spread out before her like an unwritten page. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. I almost didn't answer it, but the caller ID showed my daughter Lisa's name. "Mom?" Her voice was tight with anxiety. "Dad called me. He said you've lost your mind, that you've kicked him out over some misunderstanding about money." I closed my eyes. Of course Richard had called the children. Of course he'd painted himself as the victim of his confused, irrational wife. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Lisa. Your father has been stealing from our accounts and lying to me about his business dealings. Mom? That's impossible. Dad would never— Lisa, I interrupted. Your father told our bank I had dementia so he could access money without my signature. He filed for divorce without telling me and planned to leave me penniless. I have court documents proving everything. Silence on the other end of the line. That doesn't sound like Dad, Lisa said finally, but her voice had lost its certainty. It doesn't sound like the man we thought he was, I agreed. But it's exactly like the man he became. We talked for another hour, and slowly, I watched my daughter's image of her father shift and realign. She remembered the times Richard had borrowed money from her college fund, the way he'd pressured her to sign papers she didn't understand when she turned 21, the expensive gifts that appeared during periods when he claimed they were financially struggling. Mom, she said finally, I'm sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you. You couldn't have seen what I chose not to see, I told her. And I couldn't protect myself as long as I believed I didn't deserve protection. After we hung up, I walked through the apartment that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. This was my space now, my decisions, my life. I opened Richard's desk drawer and found folders of documents I'd never been allowed to see. Investment statements, business contracts, insurance policies, all the financial architecture of our shared life, kept carefully hidden from the person most affected by it. At the bottom of the drawer, I found something that made my hands shake. A letter, addressed to Richard, from a real estate agent in Arizona. It detailed a house he'd put a deposit on, a 3-bedroom ranch with a view of the mountains. The letter was dated 6 months ago, and it referenced previous conversations about his new circumstances and his need for a fresh start. He'd been planning this for at least 6 months. The divorce, the theft, the abandonment. It wasn't a sudden decision or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated plan to eliminate me from his life while keeping the money I'd helped him earn. I should have felt devastated. I should have felt betrayed beyond repair. And I did feel those things, but underneath them was something I hadn't experienced in decades. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. Relief that I didn't have to make excuses for his absences, his coldness, his casual dismissal of my thoughts and feelings. Relief that I could stop trying to earn love from someone who'd stopped giving it years ago. The next morning, I woke up at 8 o'clock instead of 5:30. I made myself breakfast and ate it slowly, reading the newspaper without rushing to accommodate someone else's schedule. I wore a red sweater that Richard had always said was too bright for someone my age. At 10 o'clock, Patricia called with an update. We've frozen all the joint accounts, she said. Richard's lawyer contacted us this morning. Apparently, he wants to negotiate a settlement rather than face criminal charges. What kind of settlement? He's offering to return all the stolen funds plus interest, relinquish his claim to the apartment, and pay for your legal fees. In exchange, you agree not to press charges. I thought about it. And if I don't agree? Then we proceed with both criminal and civil cases. It will take longer, cost more, and be more stressful for you. But he'll likely face jail time, and you'll recover more money in damages. I surprised myself by asking, "What would you do?" Patricia laughed. Mrs. Henley, I've been practicing family law for 15 years. In my experience, the best revenge is living well. Take the settlement, get your money back, and spend your energy building the life you want, instead of punishing the man who tried to steal it. That afternoon, I walked to Riverside Park and found the same bench where Sarah had asked for my help. I was hoping she might be there, but the park was quiet except for a few joggers and a woman walking an enormous golden retriever. I called the number Sarah had given me. "Margaret," she answered on the first ring. "I've been thinking about you all morning. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I said. "How are you?" "Victorious," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Carlson Industries withdrew their offer completely. Apparently, word spread about their tactics, and 3 of their biggest clients decided to move their portfolios elsewhere. Sometimes standing up to bullies has consequences they don't expect. And Richard? My investigator says he terminated his contract with them yesterday. He's out of the corporate espionage business, at least for now. We made plans to meet for lunch the following week. Sarah wanted to introduce me to her business partner, a woman who'd built her own financial planning firm after being pushed out of a male-dominated corporation. "You have more business sense than you realize," Sarah said. "The way you handled that meeting, the questions you asked. You could be helping other women navigate situations like this." After we hung up, I sat on the park bench watching the Hudson River flow past Manhattan's edge. The water was the same as always, but something about its movement seemed different, purposeful instead of restless. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation. Would you like to have dinner this weekend? Just the two of us. I'd like to hear more about what you've been going through." For the first time in months, someone was asking to spend time with me, not because they needed something, but because they valued my company. I spent the next few days in a strange state of suspended animation, waiting for the official end of my marriage while beginning to imagine what came next. I cleaned out closets, threw away clothes that had made me feel invisible, and discovered dresses and jewelry I'd forgotten I owned. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning. Richard had signed them without contest, agreeing to Patricia's terms: full restoration of stolen funds, no claim to the apartment, and a clean financial separation. After 47 years of marriage, our entire relationship had been reduced to legal documents and bank transfers. I should have felt sad. I expected to feel sad. But instead, I felt like I'd been released from a prison I didn't know I was in. That evening, I called my sister Helen in Portland, Oregon. We'd grown apart over the years, largely because Richard found my family exhausting and gradually discouraged visits and phone calls. "Margaret?" Helen sounded shocked to hear from me. "Is everything okay?" "Actually, Helen, everything is better than it's been in years." I told her the whole story: the meeting with Sarah, the discovery of Richard's betrayal, the divorce proceedings. Helen listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of dismay or encouragement. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished. "I'm so proud of you, and I'm so sorry you went through all of this alone. I didn't realize how alone I was until someone needed me to not be alone. What will you do now?" I looked around my apartment, seeing it as if for the first time. The furniture Richard had chosen, the colors he preferred, the books he thought were appropriate, the photographs that reflected his version of our family story. "I think I'm going to redecorate," I said. Helen laughed. "Good for you. And Margaret? I know it's been too long, but would you like to come visit? Oregon is beautiful in the spring." After we hung up, I made a list. Not a to-do list for tomorrow's chores or next week's obligations, but a list of things I wanted to do just because I wanted to do them. Learn to paint watercolors, take a photography class, visit Helen, see a Broadway show without worrying about whether Richard would enjoy it, read books that interested me, wear colors that made me happy, sleep in on Sundays, have conversations with people who listened to my answers. The next week, Sarah and I met for lunch at a small cafe in Soho. She arrived with a woman about my age, impeccably dressed with silver hair and bright blue eyes. "Margaret?" Sarah said. "This is Joan Crawford, not the actress," she always has to clarify. Joan runs a financial consulting firm that specializes in helping women over 50 take control of their money. Joan shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who took herself seriously. "Sarah told me about your situation. I'm impressed by how you handled it." "I was terrified the whole time," I admitted. "Good," Joan said. "Fear means you understand the stakes. Confidence without fear is just arrogance." Over lunch, Joan told me about her business. She worked with women who were divorcing, widowed, or simply tired of having their financial lives managed by men who didn't have their best interests at heart. "The biggest obstacle isn't lack of knowledge," Joan said. "It's decades of being told our instincts don't matter, that we're not qualified to make decisions about our own lives." "But you clearly have good instincts," Sarah added. "The questions you asked in that meeting, the way you read those men, that's not something you can teach. That's wisdom." Joan leaned forward. "Margaret, have you ever considered helping other women in situations like yours? Not as a therapist or counselor, but as someone who's been there. Someone who can walk into a room and remind a woman that she's not alone." I thought about the terror I'd felt walking into that corporate conference room, and how different it might have been if I'd had someone beside me who understood what it was like to be dismissed and underestimated. What would that look like? Financial advocacy, Joan said. You'd work with my firm on cases where women need support navigating complex financial situations, divorce proceedings, estate planning, investment management. Sometimes they need someone to translate the jargon. Sometimes they need someone to sit beside them and look calm while they ask difficult questions. I'm 72 years old. I don't have any professional experience. Joan smiled. Margaret, you've been managing a household budget, raising children, and maintaining relationships for 5 decades. You've survived financial abuse and fought back successfully. You've learned to read people, negotiate conflict, and stand up for what's right. That's not amateur experience. That's expert-level life skills that most professionals never develop. I went home that afternoon with Joan's business card and a head full of possibilities I'd never imagined. For the first time in years, someone was suggesting I had something valuable to offer, not just something valuable to give up. That weekend, Lisa came for dinner as promised. It was the first time in years we'd had a meal together without Richard dominating the conversation or steering it toward topics that interested him. Mom, Lisa said as we shared a bottle of wine on my newly rearranged living room, I owe you an apology. For what? For not seeing what was happening. For assuming Dad was taking care of things. For treating you like you were just there. I reached across the coffee table and took her hand. Lisa, you couldn't see what I didn't want you to see. I spent so much energy pretending everything was fine that I convinced myself it was fine. But it wasn't fine. No, it wasn't fine. But it's fine now. Lisa looked around the apartment, noticing the changes I'd made. New throw pillows in colors Richard would have hated. Books I'd bought because they interested me. Photographs of family and friends instead of the formal portraits he preferred. You seem different, she said. Lighter. I feel like I've been holding my breath for decades, and I'm finally exhaling. We talked until past midnight, sharing stories and memories and perspectives that had been buried under years of careful family diplomacy. Lisa told me about struggles in her own marriage, about feeling pressured to prioritize her husband's career over her own interests. I told her about dreams I'd abandoned, compromises I'd made, small daily surrenders that had accumulated into a life I didn't recognize. Mom, Lisa said as she was leaving, I'm proud of you. I know that sounds backward, a daughter telling her mother she's proud of her, but I am. You were brave. After she left, I stood in my kitchen washing our wine glasses and reflecting on the word brave. I'd never thought of myself as brave. Brave people were soldiers and firefighters and activists who marched for causes. I was just an elderly woman who'd finally gotten angry enough to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. But maybe that was brave. Maybe recognizing your worth after decades of being told you didn't have any was its own kind of courage. 3 months later, I was sitting in another conference room, this one on the 28th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. Across the table sat a woman named Patricia, not my lawyer Patricia, but another Patricia, 58 years old and recently widowed. Her husband had died suddenly, leaving behind a complex web of business investments, real estate holdings, and financial instruments that she'd never been allowed to understand. His business partner was pressuring her to sell her inherited shares for far less than they were worth, claiming the business was struggling and her continued ownership would be a burden. Patricia's hands shook as she tried to read through the documents. I don't understand any of this, she whispered. Robert always handled everything. I feel so stupid. You're not stupid, I said firmly. You're uninformed. There's a difference. Joan had briefed me on the case. Patricia's husband had built a successful commercial real estate business worth several $1,000,000. His partner wanted to buy her out for roughly 20% of her actual shares' value, banking on her ignorance and emotional vulnerability. Patricia, I said, your husband spent 30 years building this business. He worked nights and weekends, took risks, made sacrifices. Do you think he did all of that so his partner could cheat his wife after he died? She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. But I don't know how to run a business. I've never even balanced a checkbook. You don't have to run the business. You have to understand what it's worth and make sure you're treated fairly. The day-to-day operations can be handled by managers. That's what they're paid for. Over the next 2 hours, Joan walked Patricia through the financial documents, explaining each component in plain English. I watched Patricia's posture change as she began to understand the scope of what her husband had built and what she was being asked to give up. Mrs. Davidson, Patricia got up enough in the meeting to address the business partner directly. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I won't be selling my shares at this time. I'll be hiring my own business manager to help me understand my role as a co-owner. The man's face went red. Mrs. Wilson, you're making a mistake. This business requires full-time attention, complex decision-making, industry relationships you don't have. Then I suppose you'll need to help me develop those relationships, Patricia said calmly. Since we're partners now. After the meeting, Patricia hugged me in the elevator. Thank you, she said. I never could have done that alone. Yes, you could have. You just needed to remember that you had the right to do it. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about the day. How does it feel? She asked. Your first official case as a financial advocate. Terrifying and exhilarating, I admitted. But right. It feels right. That's because you're using skills you've always had. You're just applying them differently now. I'd been working with Joan's firm for 2 months, taking on 1 or 2 cases each week. Women going through divorces, dealing with estate issues, trying to understand investment portfolios that had been managed by men who never bothered to explain them. Each case was different, but the underlying issue was always the same. Smart, capable women who'd been told for so long that financial matters were too complex for them that they'd begun to believe it. My job wasn't to understand every detail of securities law or tax code. My job was to sit beside these women and remind them that they had the right to ask questions, demand explanations, and insist on being treated with respect. Sometimes that was enough to shift the entire dynamic of a negotiation. 6 months after that first meeting with Sarah, I received a call that surprised me. Mrs. Henley, this is Detective Morrison with the Manhattan Financial Crimes Unit. I'm calling about your ex-husband, Richard Henley. My stomach dropped. What about him? We've arrested him for running a securities fraud scheme. He's been using false identities to gain access to elderly clients' accounts and transferring funds to offshore investments that don't exist. We estimate he's stolen over $3 million from at least 15 victims. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. When did this happen? We arrested him this morning. Mrs. Henley, we have reason to believe you may have been one of his early victims. Would you be willing to come in and give a statement? $3 million. 15 victims. All elderly, all trusting, all believing they were working with a legitimate financial advisor who had their best interests at heart. I thought about Patricia, shaking as she tried to understand documents that determined her financial future. I thought about Sarah, fighting to maintain control of the business her father had built. I thought about all the women who didn't have lawyers like Patricia, or investigators like Sarah's, who had to face men like Richard with nothing but their instincts and their hope that someone would treat them fairly. Yes, I told Detective Morrison, I'll give you a statement, and I'll testify if you need me to. At the police station, I learned about the scope of Richard's operation. After leaving me, he'd moved to Florida and set up a fake investment firm targeting retirement communities. He'd used his charm and his legitimate knowledge of financial markets to gain elderly clients' trust, then systematically drained their accounts. Mrs. Henley, Detective Morrison said, your divorce settlement may have prevented him from stealing more from you, but it also drove him to find other victims. These people lost their life savings. I felt a familiar anger rising, but this time it wasn't personal. It was anger on behalf of people I'd never met, people who'd trusted someone who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity. What can I do to help? Testify about his pattern of behavior. Help us establish that this wasn't a recent development but part of a long-term pattern of financial abuse. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. In the meantime, I continued working with Joan's firm and building a life that felt authentically mine for the first time in decades. I took the watercolor class I'd promised myself and discovered I had a talent for painting landscapes. I visited Helen in Portland and spent 2 weeks hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, feeling muscles I'd forgotten I had. I read novels that Richard would have dismissed as frivolous and watched movies that made me laugh until my sides hurt. But the most significant change was how I moved through the world. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer automatically deferred to others' preferences or assumed my opinions mattered less than anyone else's. I'd learned the difference between being kind and being invisible, between being accommodating and being taken advantage of. Lisa and I grew closer than we'd been since she was a child. Without Richard's presence dominating family gatherings, we could have actual conversations about things that mattered to both of us. She told me she was considering leaving her job to start her own marketing consultancy, and I encouraged her instead of counseling caution the way I might have when I was still married to a man who saw women's ambitions as wasteful indulgences. My son David took longer to accept the new version of his mother. He'd inherited Richard's assumption that women should be grateful for male protection and guidance, and he struggled with my independence. "Mom," he said during one particularly tense phone conversation, "don't you think you're being a little extreme? Dad made mistakes, but you're acting like he's some kind of criminal. David, your father is a criminal. He's awaiting trial for securities fraud. That's different. That's business." "No, David. Stealing from me was business too. Lying to me was business. Planning to divorce me and leave me with nothing was business. The only difference between what he did to me and what he did to his other victims is that I had a good lawyer." The conversation ended with David hanging up on me, but I didn't chase after him or apologize for stating facts he didn't want to hear. The old Margaret would have called back immediately, smoothing over the conflict, taking responsibility for his emotional discomfort. The new Margaret let him sit with the truth until he was ready to face it. 3 months later, David called to apologize. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me. "About Dad, about how he treated you. I remember things now that I ignored at the time. The way he dismissed your opinions, the way he made decisions without consulting you. I'm sorry I didn't see it. You couldn't see what I worked so hard to hide," I told him. "I spent 47 years pretending everything was fine because I thought that's what good wives were supposed to do." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came Richard's trial. I testified for 3 hours, describing decades of financial manipulation and emotional control. The prosecutor was a young woman who asked clear, direct questions that allowed me to tell my story without drama or self-pity. "Mrs. Henley," she said during cross-examination, "the defense has suggested that your ex-husband's later actions were aberrant behavior brought on by stress and financial pressure. Based on your 47 years of marriage to him, do you believe that's accurate?" I looked across the courtroom at Richard, sitting beside his lawyer in an expensive suit his victims had probably paid for. He looked older, smaller somehow, like a balloon that had been slowly deflating. "No," I said. "The behavior I witnessed during our marriage was identical to what he did to his other victims. The only difference was scale and opportunity. He manipulated me for decades before he had access to other people's money. When I stopped being accessible, he found new targets." Richard was convicted on 14 counts of securities fraud and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The judge ordered him to pay full restitution to his victims, though most of the stolen money was never recovered. After the trial, I stood outside the courthouse with several of Richard's other victims. They were all women over 65, all widowed or divorced, all targeted because Richard recognized they were lonely and uncertain about financial matters. "Mrs. Henley," one of them said to me, "thank you for testifying. It helped us understand that we weren't alone, that this wasn't our fault." That afternoon, I went home to my apartment and sat in the living room I'd redecorated to reflect my own taste. The walls were painted a warm yellow that Richard would have found too bold. My paintings hung beside photographs of family and friends who actually enjoyed my company. Books I loved were stacked on tables where Richard's business magazines used to create carefully maintained piles of importance. I poured myself a glass of wine and called Sarah. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Free," I said. "Finally, completely free. What's next?" I looked around my little apartment, thinking about the women I'd helped through Joan's firm, the testimony I'd given, the life I was building one decision at a time. "I think I want to expand my advocacy work. There are so many women out there who need someone to sit beside them and remind them they're not alone." "That sounds perfect for you." That evening, I made another list. Not of things I wanted to do someday, but of things I was going to do. I was going to work with Joan to develop a program for women recovering from financial abuse. I was going to write about my experience, maybe speak at senior centers and community organizations. I was going to travel, paint, read, and cultivate friendships with people who valued my presence. I was going to live like someone who mattered. A year later, I was standing in front of a room full of women at a community center in Brooklyn, telling my story to an audience of faces that reflected my own journey. Some looked skeptical, some frightened, some angry. All of them looked tired in the way that comes from years of making yourself invisible. The hardest part, I told them, isn't recognizing that you deserve better treatment. The hardest part is believing you have the power to demand it. After my talk, women approached me with their own stories. Husbands who controlled every penny. Children who saw their mothers as sources of money rather than sources of wisdom. Financial advisors who spoke to their husbands instead of them, even when the accounts were in both names. "What you did sounds so scary," one woman said. "I don't think I could ever be that brave." I looked at her, seeing myself 2 years ago. I wasn't brave when I started. I was desperate. Bravery came later, after I realized I was stronger than I thought. These days, I work with Joan's firm 3 days a week and spend my other time painting, traveling, and maintaining relationships that feed my soul instead of draining it. I've learned to cook meals I actually enjoy, wear clothes that make me happy, and sleep late on Sundays without feeling guilty. Lisa and I have dinner together twice a month, and our conversations are the kind I used to envy when I watched other mothers and daughters who seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. David visits occasionally, still adjusting to having a mother with opinions and boundaries, but learning to respect both. Sarah and I have become close friends. She's expanded her investment business and now mentors other young women trying to break into finance. Sometimes we joke about the strange way we met, how a desperate request from a stranger led to both of us reclaiming our power. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked for your help that day?" Sarah asked during one of our monthly lunches. "I probably would have gone home to an empty apartment, made excuses for Richard's absence, and spent another year disappearing a little more each day. And I probably would have lost my business." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe you would have found your strength some other way. Some of us just need permission to believe we're worth fighting for." Helen visits twice a year now, and I've spent several weeks at her house in Oregon, rediscovering parts of myself that got buried under decades of being the person I thought I was supposed to be. We hike and paint and talk about books and politics, and the strange liberation that comes with aging out of the need to please everyone. "You know what I admire most about your transformation?" Helen said during my last visit. "You didn't become a different person. You became yourself. That's the truth I try to share with the women I work with now. You don't need to become someone new. You need to remember who you were before you learned to make yourself small, before you started apologizing for existing, before you accepted that your needs mattered less than everyone else's comfort. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's rarely comfortable. There were nights, especially in the first few months after Richard left, when the silence felt oppressive and I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Loneliness can be a cruel companion, and there were times when I questioned whether being respected was worth being alone. But respect and solitude aren't the same thing. Once I stopped accepting whatever attention was offered regardless of how it was delivered, I found myself connecting with people who actually enjoyed my company. Patricia and Joan and Sarah and Helen and Lisa. None of them love me because I'm useful or convenient or undemanding. They love me because they like who I am when I'm not pretending to be someone else. The other day, I was walking through Riverside Park, and I saw a woman about my age sitting alone on a bench, staring at her phone with the particular expression of someone who's just received disappointing news. I recognized that look, that posture, that careful composure of someone who's learned not to expect too much. I almost walked past. 2 years ago, I definitely would have walked past, assuming she wanted privacy, assuming I had nothing to offer, assuming my presence would be an intrusion rather than a kindness. Instead, I stopped. "Excuse me," I said. "I don't mean to bother you, but you look like you might need someone to talk to." She looked up, surprised. "Oh, that's kind of you, but I'm fine." I sat down on the bench beside her. I used to say that a lot. "I'm fine," usually when I was anything but fine. She studied my face for a moment, then smiled ruefully. "It's my daughter." She just canceled our dinner plans because something came up with her boyfriend. This is the third time this month. How long has she been taking your time for granted? The question surprised her. Well, it's not like that. She's busy, she has her own life. Of course she does. But so do you. We talked for 20 minutes. Her name was Eleanor, and she was 74 years old, recently retired from teaching, and struggling with the realization that the grown children she'd devoted her life to rarely had time for her unless they needed something. I raised them to be independent, she said. I just didn't realize that might mean they wouldn't need me anymore. There's a difference between being needed and being valued, I told her. You raised them to be independent so they could choose to spend time with you, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When we parted ways, I gave her my phone number. Call me if you'd like to have coffee sometime. Not because you need anything, just because you might enjoy the company. She called 3 days later, and we met at a little cafe in the village where we talked for 2 hours about books and travel, and the strange adventure of rediscovering yourself in your 70s. Eleanor reminded me of something important. My story isn't unique. There are thousands of women my age who've spent decades making themselves small, accommodating others' needs, apologizing for existing. Some of them are ready to change. Some of them just need permission to believe they deserve better. Some of them are still sitting on park benches, staring at phones that deliver disappointing news, wondering if this is all there is. I can't save everyone. I can't even save anyone, really. But I can sit beside them and tell them they're not alone. I can share my story and let them know that change is possible, that it's never too late to start valuing yourself, that respect is not too much to ask for at any age. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. This morning, I woke up at 8 o'clock instead of dawn, made myself coffee that was exactly as strong as I like it, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. I thought about the blind stranger who changed my life by asking me to pretend to be her mother, who needed me to be someone I'd forgotten I was capable of being. I thought about Richard, serving his sentence in federal prison, finally facing consequences for treating people as sources of profit rather than human beings deserving of respect. I thought about the women I've helped, the testimony I've given, the relationships I've rebuilt, the life I've reclaimed one decision at a time. And I thought about you, listening to my story, maybe recognizing parts of your own experience in mine. If you're living with someone who makes you feel invisible, who dismisses your concerns, who treats your needs as optional, you deserve better. If you're making excuses for behavior that damages your spirit, if you're accepting whatever attention you can get regardless of how it's delivered, if you're apologizing for existing, you are worth more than that. Change is scary. Loneliness is real. Standing up for yourself can feel impossible when you've spent decades learning to be accommodating. But you are stronger than you know. You have wisdom that comes from experience. You have the right to be treated with dignity, regardless of your age, regardless of how long you've accepted less. Eleanor and I have become part of a growing circle of women who meet monthly at the community center. We call ourselves the Second Chapter Circle. Women who've decided that the story isn't over just because we've reached a certain age or faced certain losses. Some are divorced, some widowed, some never married, but tired of being treated as if their single status made them incomplete. What we all share is the recognition that we've been living according to other people's expectations for so long that we'd forgotten we had the right to our own expectations. Last month, a woman named Catherine joined our group. She was 81 years old and had just moved her abusive son out of her house after 40 years of making excuses for his behavior and supporting his refusal to work or contribute to the household. Her hands shook as she told us about the day she finally called the police when he threatened to hit her over money. I kept thinking I was a bad mother, she said, that I owed him a place to live because I was his parent. Even when he stole from me, even when he brought drugs into my house, even when he screamed at me for hours about things that weren't my fault. The group listened without judgment as Catherine described decades of emotional terrorism from a son who'd learned that his mother's love meant unlimited tolerance for his worst behavior. What changed? Eleanor asked gently. Catherine smiled through her tears. My neighbor's granddaughter came to visit. She was about 7 years old. And she saw my son screaming at me in the yard one day. She came over later and asked me why I let the mean man yell at me. I tried to explain that he was my son, that parents have to love their children no matter what. And she looked at me with those big eyes and said, "But doesn't he have to love you back?" That simple question from a 7-year-old had shattered 40 years of misguided martyrdom. Catherine realized that unconditional love didn't mean unconditional tolerance for abuse, that being someone's mother didn't make her responsible for enabling their failures indefinitely. "I gave him 30 days to find somewhere else to live," Catherine said. "He called me every horrible name you can imagine, told me I was a failure as a mother, tried to guilt me into changing my mind. But I kept thinking about that little girl asking why love only went one direction." Catherine's son moved out eventually, taking some of her valuables with him, but leaving behind something more precious: her peace of mind. She'd spent 3 months in her house without someone raging at her, criticizing her, making her feel responsible for his emotions and his choices. "I'd forgotten what my own thoughts sounded like," she told us. "When you're constantly managing someone else's anger, you stop having opinions about anything that might set them off. I'd been so busy walking on eggshells that I'd forgotten I had the right to walk normally." Stories like Catherine's reminded me that financial abuse was just one way people could steal your life from you. There was emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, the slow erosion of boundaries that happened so gradually you didn't notice until you'd become a supporting character in your own story. Meanwhile, my advocacy work continued to evolve. Joan and I had developed a workshop series called Financial Foundations for Women Over 50, which we presented at libraries, community centers, and senior living facilities throughout the city. The workshops covered basic investment principles, estate planning, and, most importantly, how to recognize and prevent financial exploitation. But the part of each presentation that generated the most response was when I told my own story. Women would approach me afterward with their own experiences of being excluded from financial decisions, of having their concerns dismissed, of discovering too late that the person they trusted most had betrayed that trust in devastating ways. One woman named Grace told me about discovering that her late husband had been gambling away their retirement funds for years. She'd trusted him completely to handle their finances, never questioning his explanations for their dwindling savings or his mood swings around money. Only after his death did she discover the extent of the losses. Over $400,000 in retirement accounts, gone to online poker and sports betting. "He was so smart about everything else," she said, bewildered even months after the discovery. "He was a professor. He published books. He could analyze complex problems in his field. But he threw away our entire future on games where the house always wins." Grace's situation was different from mine. Her husband's betrayal had been driven by addiction rather than calculated greed. But the result was the same. A woman in her 70s, facing the rest of her life with almost no financial resources, trying to rebuild security from nothing. I connected Grace with resources for families affected by gambling addiction, helped her navigate the process of social service applications she'd never imagined needing, and most importantly, sat with her while she processed the rage and grief that came with discovering that the partnership she'd believed in was largely fictional. "I keep thinking I should have known," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "There must have been signs I ignored." "Grace," I said, "when you trust someone completely, you interpret everything they do through the lens of that trust. That's not naivety. That's love. The problem isn't that you trusted him. The problem is that he wasn't worthy of your trust." It was a lesson I was still learning myself. For months after discovering Richard's betrayal, I'd tortured myself with questions about what I should have seen, what I should have known, what I should have done differently. But gradually, I'd come to understand that the ability to lie convincingly and manipulate systematically wasn't something I wanted to be good at recognizing. The fact that I'd been fooled said more about Richard's skill at deception than my failure at detection. My relationship with both my children continued to evolve as they adjusted to having a mother who had opinions and boundaries. Lisa had embraced the change, often telling me she was inspired by my transformation and that it had given her permission to be more assertive in her own life. She'd started her marketing consultancy and landed several major clients by approaching negotiations with the confidence I was just learning to model. David's adjustment was more complicated. During one of his visits, he finally admitted what had been bothering him about my new independence. "I guess I'm realizing that I learned some things from Dad that I'm not proud of," he said. "The way he talked about women, the way he dismissed your opinions. I absorbed more of that than I want to admit. David, you were a child learning how relationships worked by watching us. Children don't think critically about their parents' behavior. They just internalize it as normal. But I'm not a child anymore. And I can see now that some of the ways I treat women, including you, came directly from watching how Dad treated you." It was a painful conversation, but an important one. David talked about recognizing similar patterns in his own marriage, dismissing his wife's concerns about money, making unilateral decisions about purchases or investments, assuming his career priorities should automatically take precedence over hers. "I never hit her or screamed at her," he said. "I thought that made me a good husband. But I realize now that there are lots of ways to make someone feel small that don't involve violence." The conversation led to David asking if I'd be willing to talk with him and his wife together about healthy financial partnerships. It was exactly the kind of request the old Margaret would have declined, assuming she had nothing valuable to contribute to a younger couple's marriage. The new Margaret agreed immediately. 2 weeks later, I sat in their living room as David apologized to his wife for years of financial secrecy and unilateral decision-making. He showed her accounts she'd never known existed, admitted to purchases he'd hidden, and asked her to become a full partner in their financial planning rather than a recipient of his decisions. "I watched my father steal from my mother for decades," he told her. "Not just money, but agency. The right to participate in decisions about her own life. I swore I'd never do that. But I realize I was doing it in smaller ways every day." His wife cried, partly from relief at finally being included in decisions that affected her future, partly from grief over the years she'd spent feeling shut out of important aspects of their shared life. But they worked together over the following months to build new patterns of communication and shared responsibility. Watching David transform his marriage by confronting the negative lessons he'd absorbed from Richard was one of the most gratifying experiences of my new life. It felt like proof that the cycles of financial and emotional abuse that had shaped my generation didn't have to continue into the next. As my second year of independence approached, I realized I'd unconsciously started measuring time differently. Instead of marking days by what Richard needed or wanted, I measured them by what I accomplished, what I learned, whom I helped, how I grew. Sarah's business had continued to flourish, and she'd started a mentorship program for young women in finance. She often invited me to speak to her mentees about the importance of maintaining their agency in both professional and personal relationships. "You represent something important to these women," she told me before one such speaking engagement. "You're proof that it's never too late to reclaim your power, that age doesn't disqualify you from reinventing your life." The young women Sarah mentored were in their 20s and 30s, beginning their careers in a field that still challenged women at every level. They faced different obstacles than I had. They were establishing themselves professionally rather than recovering from decades of marginalization, but the underlying issues were often similar. They told me about male colleagues who interrupted them in meetings, who took credit for their ideas, who questioned their expertise in ways they never questioned men's. They talked about romantic partners who expected them to manage all the emotional labor in relationships while contributing equally to household finances. They described family members who treated their career ambitions as optional or selfish compared to the men in their families. "The thing is," one of them said after I'd spoken about my experience, "you had to wait until you were 72 to stand up for yourself. We want to learn how to do it now, while we're still building our lives." That conversation sparked an idea that became my most ambitious project yet. Working with Joan and Sarah and several other women in finance, we developed a program called Financial Futures for Women of All Ages. It offered workshops, mentorship opportunities, and support groups for women at every stage of life who wanted to take control of their financial destinies. The program served women in their 20s just starting careers alongside women in their 70s trying to recover from financial abuse. We had sessions on everything from salary negotiation to retirement planning, to recognizing the warning signs of financial manipulation. But what made the program unique was the intergenerational mentorship component. Older women who'd learned hard lessons about money and power were paired with younger women who could benefit from their experience. Younger women with technical training and current market knowledge shared their expertise with older women who might have been excluded from financial education for decades. I found myself mentoring several young women while being mentored by others in areas where I had less experience. Maria, a financial advisor in her 30s, taught me about cryptocurrency and online investment platforms. In exchange, I helped her navigate a complicated situation with a business partner who was trying to exclude her from major decisions about their firm's future. "You have something I don't have yet," Maria told me during one of our meetings. "You have the authority that comes with age and experience. When you speak, people listen differently than when I say the same thing." She was right. In meetings where both of us were present, my gray hair and measured cadence gave weight to arguments that might be dismissed if they came from a younger woman. It was a privilege I'd never recognized when I was younger, and I was learning to use it strategically on behalf of women who faced different but related challenges. The program grew beyond anything we'd initially imagined. We started with monthly workshops for 20 women, and within 6 months, we're hosting events for over 200 participants. Local news stations interviewed us about financial literacy for women. Other cities asked us to help them develop similar programs. But the most meaningful moments still happened one-on-one, when individual women found the courage to make changes they'd been contemplating for years. Eleanor, the woman I'd met on the park bench, used the confidence she gained from our friendship to have difficult conversations with her adult children about their tendency to treat her like an ATM rather than a person. She set boundaries about lending money and established consequences for taking her time for granted. Catherine, who'd evicted her abusive son, used the piece of her recovered home to start a small catering business using family recipes. At 81, she was earning her own income for the first time in decades and discovering talents she'd never had the space to develop. Grace, whose husband had gambled away their retirement, qualified for a part-time position helping other seniors navigate social services. Her experience with the bureaucratic maze of assistance programs made her invaluable to others facing similar challenges. Each of these women had found ways to transform their losses into sources of strength, their painful experiences into wisdom they could share with others. They reminded me daily that resilience wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about refusing to let hardship define the limits of what was possible. As I approached my 3rd anniversary of independence, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that October afternoon when a blind stranger asked me to pretend to be her mother. The woman who'd sat on that park bench, invisible and forgotten, felt like a character from someone else's story. These days, my calendar was full of commitments that energized rather than depressed me. Speaking engagements, mentoring sessions, advocacy meetings, social gatherings with friends who valued my company. I traveled to conferences in other cities, consulted on cases involving financial elder abuse, wrote articles for publications that reached women across the country. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. I no longer apologized for taking up space, for having opinions, for expecting to be treated with respect. I no longer measured my worth by other people's approval or comfort levels. I'd learned the difference between being kind and being invisible, between being supportive and being a doormat. The apartment I'd shared with Richard had become a home that reflected my tastes, my interests, my values. The walls displayed artwork I'd created and photographs of experiences I'd chosen. The bookshelves held novels and poetry and memoirs that spoke to my heart rather than books chosen to impress visitors. The furniture was arranged for my comfort rather than Richard's preferences. But more than the physical changes, I'd created a life filled with relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience or habit. Sarah had become one of my closest friends, someone I could call with good news or frustrations, someone who sought my advice and offered hers in return. Helen and I had recovered the sisterhood we'd had before Richard's influence drove us apart. My relationships with both my children had deepened as they learned to see me as a full person, rather than just a supporting character in their family story. I'd also developed friendships with women from the advocacy program, relationships that spanned decades and backgrounds, but were unified by a shared commitment to living authentically. We celebrated each other's victories, supported each other through challenges, and reminded each other regularly that our voices and experiences mattered. Looking back, I could hardly believe I'd spent so many years accepting so little, not just from Richard, but from life in general. I'd accepted crumbs of attention, scraps of respect, the bare minimum of consideration, all while telling myself I should be grateful for whatever I received. Now I understood that gratitude and standards weren't mutually exclusive. I could appreciate kindness while still expecting basic decency. I could be thankful for love while insisting that it be demonstrated through actions, not just words. I could value relationships while maintaining boundaries about how I deserved to be treated within them. The work I was doing with other women continued to evolve and expand. We'd started a podcast called Never Too Late that featured interviews with women who'd made major life changes after age 60. We had writers, entrepreneurs, activists, artists, women who'd discovered or rediscovered their passions and pursued them despite societal messages about age limitations. One of my favorite episodes featured a woman named Dorothy who'd earned her law degree at age 73 and now worked as a legal advocate for nursing home residents. Another highlighted Maria, who'd left an abusive marriage at 68 and started a jewelry-making business that now employed 6 other women from her community. Each story reinforced the same message. It's never too late to choose yourself, to prioritize your own dreams and needs, to insist on being treated with dignity and respect. But we also featured episodes about the challenges of starting over later in life, the financial constraints, the health concerns, the social isolation that could make change feel impossible. We talked honestly about grief, for time lost, opportunities missed, relationships that couldn't be salvaged. In one particularly powerful episode, I interviewed a woman named Ruth whose husband had controlled every aspect of her life for 43 years before dying suddenly of a heart attack. At 70, she'd never written a check, driven a car at night, or made a decision more complex than what to serve for dinner. I felt like I was starting from zero, Ruth told our listeners, like a child who had to learn how to be an adult. I didn't know how to be alone, how to make choices, how to trust my own judgment about anything. But Ruth had persevered, taking classes in financial management, joining support groups for widows, slowly building the skills and confidence she'd never been allowed to develop. 2 years after her husband's death, she'd learned to drive, moved to a smaller apartment she'd chosen herself, and started volunteering at a local literacy program. The hardest part wasn't learning new skills, she reflected. It was learning to believe I deserved to make my own choices, that my preferences mattered as much as anyone else's. Ruth's story resonated with thousands of listeners who related to the experience of feeling unprepared for independence, whether due to widowhood, divorce, or simply recognizing that they'd spent decades deferring their needs to others. The podcast connected me with women across the country and around the world. We received emails from listeners in small towns and major cities, from women in their 60s to their 90s, all sharing stories of transformation, struggle, and triumph. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman in rural Montana whose controlling husband had died 6 months earlier. She'd been listening to our podcast while learning to manage the ranch they'd owned together, something he'd never allowed her to participate in during their 36-year marriage. "I always thought I was stupid about business and money," she wrote. "My husband told me I didn't have the mind for it, that I should stick to cooking and cleaning while he handled the important decisions. But after listening to your stories, I realized I'd been running the household budget, managing complex schedules, and solving problems every day. Those are exactly the skills I need to run this ranch." She'd not only kept the ranch operational, but had diversified into agritourism, offering riding lessons and farm-to-table dinners that had become popular with visitors from nearby national parks. What her husband had dismissed as women's work, hospitality, organization, attention to detail, had become the foundation for expanding their business in ways he'd never imagined. Stories like hers reminded me that the skills women develop in supporting roles, managing multiple priorities, reading emotional cues, adapting to changing circumstances, solving problems with limited resources, are exactly the skills needed for leadership and entrepreneurship. We'd just been taught to undervalue them because they weren't typically rewarded in male-dominated environments. As my advocacy work gained recognition, I was invited to speak at conferences and events across the country. I found myself on panels about financial literacy, women's rights, and aging with dignity. Each speaking engagement was an opportunity to reach more women who might benefit from hearing that change was possible at any age. But the most meaningful encounters continued to happen in small, intimate settings. Coffee shops where women confided their fears about leaving unsatisfying relationships. Community centers where support groups provided safe spaces for processing old wounds and planning new futures. Living rooms where multi-generational conversations helped families address patterns of financial secrecy or emotional manipulation. In each of these settings, I saw reflections of my own journey. The recognition that something was wrong, the fear of change, the gradual building of courage, the discovery of inner strength that had been there all along but had been suppressed or ignored. I also witnessed the ripple effects of individual transformation. Women who found their voices in financial matters often became more assertive in other areas of their lives. They set boundaries with adult children who treated them as sources of free labor or money. They demanded better treatment from healthcare providers who dismissed their concerns. They pursued interests and friendships they'd neglected while prioritizing others' needs. Perhaps most importantly, they modeled different possibilities for the younger women in their families and communities. Daughters and granddaughters watched them make choices, express opinions, and insist on respect. The message was clear. Women don't expire at a certain age, don't become irrelevant after their reproductive years, don't have to accept invisibility as the price of aging. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever found yourself making excuses for someone who should be making excuses to you? Tell me in the comments. Share your story, your struggles, your small victories. Let other people know they're not alone. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own worth, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me reach other women who might need to hear that they matter, that they're valued, that it's never too late to start living like someone who deserves respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to remind you that you are not invisible. You are not too old. You are not asking for too much. You are enough. You have always been enough. And you deserve to live like you believe it.